Welcome, everybody, to join this discussion about the movie that you just saw about influence. My name is Rick Nieman. I'm a Dutch journalist, and I'm joined by two people with extensive experience in both political campaigning, in strategies, in reputation management. They're well-known names here in the Netherlands, but they've worked internationally as well, especially in the United States. So please help me in joining Hans Anker and Kai van der Linde. Gentlemen, good to see you both.
Thank you, Rick. Good to be here.
It's nice to see you again. Let's talk about this very, very interesting film. Tim Bell is some kind of person. First of all, I'd like from the two of you your takeaway from this movie. What was the thing that impressed you most or that surprised you most? Hans, let me start with you. What is your takeaway?
I think it's a fascinating document. But the most fascinating part for me was to finally see the faces on the people that I've been up against. And I was watching the documentaries and getting slightly annoyed by some of the portrayals. And just at that point, all of a sudden, my former boss, Stan Greenberg, shows up and to give his version of how we experienced some of these events on the other side of the aisle, so to say. And the reality is that, as Stan said, we're basically dealing with the consequences of the acts of these people. We never really met them in person. Stan never met Tim Bell. I've never met most of these people, but we are working against them. And it's actually similar with Kai. I mean, Kai and I met only after we had been up against each other in the 2002 campaign in the Netherlands.
And then come on, Hans, I don't mean to interrupt you right away, but you mean to tell me you did not know that Tim Bell and some of these other people were on the other side of, as you call it, the aisle in the battles that you fought for public relations attention and images and so on?
The thing is that we don't study these people. So, there is Saatchi and Saatchi. And for a brief moment in 1989, the Labour Party in the Netherlands, they signed a contract with Saatchi and Saatchi, and then shortly thereafter separated because of cultural differences. I've been involved in Israeli elections where Arthur Finkelstein would be a constant working for Netanyahu, but we were not very interested in these individuals. We were interested in what they were doing and what they were making the candidate do, and that's where you're engaging.
Okay, I'll get back to that in a second, but first I want to go to Kai. Kai, what your takeaway from the film? What surprised you or impressed you most?
Well, I thought that the production values were really top of the line. It was very well shot, very well made, and I thought it was a fascinating rags to riches and into the gutter story. I mean, Tim Bell was a brilliant PR man who chose a very specific and lucrative business model, which is that if you want to work for the bad guys, you can make a lot of money because most people do not want to work for the bad guys. I mean, look behind me. I'm in a simple attic office. If I had chosen to work for the bad guys, I would be speaking to you from my pied-à-terre in Cannes, and that's kind of what came across. And what actually interested me or fascinated me most is that he didn't apologize for it. He said, "This is what it is. I'm not the Pope, and
I'm not a priest." He said,
"You're not a priest." Yeah. And the fact that the documentary makers actually got him on the record on tape, I think, was that was very, very interesting.
Still, though, I mean, what we saw here, guys, was, as you say, good production values. It's an impressive documentary, but then again, how much did we actually see of how this influence that Bell is sometimes proud of and definitely not ashamed of is exercised? In other words, he has this wonderful quote somewhere, let me look it up. So much of power is an illusion and so much of influence is a delusion. Hans, how much power did Bell actually exercise? I mean, we know the stories about, how with the slogan, labor isn't working, he defeated the Tories and so on. But give me some real examples of where you think he made or they made the difference.
Actually, I think that scene in the movie is quite interesting, especially on the receiving end for me, because we hated that line, labor isn't moving, because it's so powerful. And maybe it's powerful in a different way of using the word power, but it has been tremendously influential. In any other campaign after that campaign, we were constantly worried about the opponent coming up with a line like that. And you can tell actually from the movie, and whether it's all true remains to be seen, frankly, also given sort of the credibility of the main character. But it sounds plausible to me that Jim Callahan was that he got so much under his skin that he actually unintentionally magnified the impact of the message. But the message rings true. The message is, it really hits you in the heart, because for Labour parties to be weak on their core issue of labor is incredibly damaging. And so that's the lesson I've learned from that particular episode. This whole storyline manifested itself in the 80s and 90s a slightly different way, where center right-wing parties would claim to be the real party of labor. But that's just a variation on the same theme.
And in terms of tactics, is it about finding the weak spot of your opponent and then, as you say, magnifying it and making that the storyline? I remember in 1979, old enough for that, in the UK, the trash was piling up. It was a mess. There were rats in the streets, and there were long lines in front of the unemployment offices. So yeah, there was that weakness. Is that the quote unquote brilliance of Bell at that moment? It's
entirely different. It's finding the strong spot of your opponent and eliminating it.
Oh, okay. Explain, and then I'll get to Kai.
This is the Karl Rove school of political campaigning. So you look for your candidate's strongest characteristic, and if you're able to make the case that he or she does not deserve to be associated with that strong contribution, then everything else falls apart.
Okay, so if somebody has strong, sorry that I'm interrupting again, but if somebody has strong credibility, you make him or her into a liar.
Think of John Kerry, the war hero, and how he ended up in the 2004 campaign. Mm-hmm. And he was swift-boated. And that's an example of exactly that sort of tactic or strategy. I think it's a tactic. But where you try to eliminate your opponent by taking away your strongest asset.
Kai, how, because obviously the film makes that point, how dangerous is the kind of influence that is being talked about here, that is being peddled? There's the quote from Nigel Oakes where he says, democracy becomes a controlled democracy, maybe available to the highest bidder. The two of you have worked a lot in the United States. You worked for both Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani, for instance, in their mayoral campaigns.
That was Kai.
Is this kind of, sorry, Hans?
That was Kai.
That was Kai, yeah, I'm talking to Kai. Sorry about that. Yeah, I know that Kai did those things. Is that true? Is the kind of work that you guys do actually undermining democracy, Kai?
Well, if it were true, obviously I would never admit that.
Come on, there's just the three of us.
Well, then the answer is no, obviously. I think what has changed is that, is the balance between trying to influence public opinion and strong journalism, strong journalists who try to keep everybody honest. People like us, Hans and me, and even Tim Bell really cannot operate successfully or try to lie and cheat when there is a culture of strong journalism, which is also why people like Tim Bell like to work in countries like Iraq and Syria, in places precisely where there is very little journalism. That makes it a lot easier to influence public opinion. He worked in Egypt. These are all countries where the media are in the hands, if there is any media to begin with, are in the hands of the state.
That's true. That's true, and I'll get to that. But also in the film, at some point, Bell says Rupert Murdoch calls him up and says, "You tell me what you want my papers to print, and I'll make sure it gets into those papers."
Yeah. So who's the crook here? Is it Tim Bell or is it Rupert Murdoch? I think that in fact, what Rupert Murdoch has done to this world is far worse than Tim Bell has done, because Rupert Murdoch pretends to be the owner of a whole bunch of independent journalists and media outlets, while he's only driving his own agenda. I think that's far more dangerous to democracy than Tim Bell. Tim Bell is kind of a convenient boogeyman for a lot of people. He's the guy you can point to and say, "Oh, look at that terrible guy." But if we go back to South Africa, which was an important part of that documentary, you know, McKinsey works in South Africa. KPMG, a big accounting firm, works in South Africa. A lot of diamond firms work in South Africa. If you talk about Russia, I think ExxonMobil and Rex Tillerson were far more powerful in terms of swaying public opinion than PR guys like us could ever do. So in the whole geopolitical thing, I think that the power of Tim Bell has been overrated, in my opinion.
But still, let's go back to the influence work that he does and that you do. You mentioned, we'll get back to the West in a second, but you mentioned countries like Iraq. There's also Ukraine, South Africa, Egypt, countries in Latin America. Hans, you have extensive international experience. I mean, in those we saw Myanmar, for instance, recently, you know, with the refugee crisis, where stories, true or not, on Facebook and other social media platforms had tremendous impact. I mean, are those countries easier to influence the process in than Western countries with perhaps a stronger journalism or what have you?
Well, if you belong to the Tim Bell school, I would say the answer is yes, because your work goes more or less unchecked. And when it comes to campaigning, campaigning is about life and death, and it's about hope and fear. And Tim Bell clearly belongs to the fear school. I'm more, most of the progressive campaigns tend to be more on the hope spectrum, which is more difficult, actually, if you come to think of it. I mean, psychologists have figured that out for us. People are more afraid. The impact of being afraid is twice as heavy, twice as big as being hopeful. And so if what you do goes unchecked, if there's no strong media, I've been involved in a campaign in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. It is very difficult to create a campaign based on hope under circumstances like that, and it's relatively easy to wage a campaign based on fear. And that plays into the hands of this very specific type of political consultant, because I think there's more or less three categories. You could say that there's the progressive consultants, there's the center-right consultants who are firmly within sort of the democratic boundaries and where the debate is about which direction is best for the country. And then there is this group of people.
This, what a spin. I mean,
go ahead, Kai. You're shaking your head like crazy. Go ahead.
I mean, let's be honest here, guys. I mean, political consultants use the tools that are available at our disposal. And it's certainly not true that progressive consultants in general are more holy or more saint-like than conservative consultants. Let's take the Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton destroyed Monica Lewinsky in the public arena using all the dirty tricks that, I mean, even Tim Bell would have been, excited at how they destroyed that young woman. And they've done that for 25 years. So the thought that progressive consultants are somehow devoid of this is just bull, frankly. I think that there are a lot of tricks. Some of them are dirty. They are all part of your toolbox. And I think in the end, it depends on your own moral center whether or not you use them. But that has nothing to do with progressive or Republican or conservative, whatever. I've known a lot of conservative consultants that are very straight, and I've known a lot of left-wing consultants that are just plain crooks.
I think Hans can defend himself, but I think what he was saying is that the progressives tend to be more on the hope side and the conservatives more on the fear. Is that your point? Fear side, Hans?
Well, I'm talking about the messaging, and the messaging also Clinton 92 was a message of hope, and I feel your pain, and it's the economy, stupid.
Mm-hmm. And they caused Monica Lewinsky a lot of pain after that.
Well, that being said, I mean, these are politicians seeking power, and that's where I would agree with Kai, is that they leave no opportunity unused to realize their goal. That's true.
I want to, in a moment, move to what the future holds for us, because I think that is very important. Nigel Oakes said a few very interesting things in the film about how the art of advertising has now become a science and that we can now guarantee certain results. But before we do that, another very important point that Kai also mentioned, morality. I mean, Tim Bell says in the film, I'm not a priest. And he also says, I'm not immoral. I'm just amoral. I don't have any morals. I just work for whomever wants to hire me. Is that, Kai, I know you said, because the two of you had a discussion not that long ago on an important Dutch current affairs program. You said you would not work for everybody. You say you've turned down people who could have, which was a powerful force at the time in Dutch politics on the far right side of the spectrum. You don't work for everybody? You've got morals?
Yes, I certainly do. I mean, look at my background. I have plenty of morals. Otherwise, I would be sitting here. I would be speaking to you from my third house in Cannes or wherever.
Yeah, but you know what I mean.
But it's difficult because it's of course I'm going to say yes, I have morals and I won't work for everybody. And I think most people would agree. And what I like about Tim Bell is that he's honest about the fact that he doesn't have morals. And it's a difficult question because what do you say to an attorney that defends drug dealers? I mean, attorneys get away with it by saying, well, everybody has a right to their defense in the court of law.
Not and quite the same thing, is it?
Well, I think you could argue certainly today that everybody has the right to a defense in the court of public opinion. I mean, let's go back to Monica Lewinsky. She was destroyed in the court of public opinion. And I think with social media and everything you see these days, quite often you're convicted in the court of public opinion. Before
but Kai, it's the other way around, right? What we're talking about here is if you want to get your guy or woman elected, are all means allowed? Are all means that are available to you allowed to be used, for instance? What do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously the answer is yes. All yes? Means that are legal are allowed, and quite often they are used, and it's up to your own morals whether you want to use, whether you want to, step on the brakes or not. And that's very difficult because if you know that the other guy's not stepping on the brakes, you got a problem. You're going to lose the election.
Before I turn to
that's
Hans,
what you see.
Yeah, before I turn to Hans, Kai, you were involved, and I remembered as well, because I was the journalist at the time as well, in the campaign of Pim Fortuyn, one of the most popular right populist movements at the time, 2002. You guys kicked him out of the party that you were working for something that we would now consider a minor issue, I think. And you forfeited the chance to have the biggest election win post-war in the Netherlands. Do you regret that after? When you look back now, do you have feelings of regret?
It proves my point. We had morals, and we felt that he had gone too far, so we kicked him out. And that basically, yes, because it in terms of my career, that certainly damaged my career. And if you look back on it now, everybody would go, "What the hell was that about?" I mean, and that's the problem. It's so hard to have an objective measurement of what is right and what is wrong. And even if you have found it, you see that keeps shifting, and that makes it complicated from a legislative point of view. Some people feel that you have to have rules and regulation limiting how political consultants can work, the money that is involved, which is another problem. So that's a tough one.
And Hans, you've always been I'm sure in your eyes on the right side of the political aisle, except for that side becomes smaller and smaller and smaller as we speak. I mean, you're and I don't mean to be rude about this, but you're a social democrat, and it's almost non-existent, this movement in the Netherlands right now.
I'm not very successful.
So you stick to your morals, but you're not successful.
Yeah, well, then you wind up having no business.
Yeah.
Well, I have been confronted with these situations. For example, in Bosnia, one of the ways for Bosnia to move out of the war was to organize elections. And one of the candidates on the ballot, Biljana Plavšić, for president, she was a convicted war criminal. And we had the discussion, should we work for her or not? And ultimately, we decided to do that because we had our conclusion was that the only way for Bosnia to reach peace was through that route. And ultimately, the campaign was successful. It's not. I mean, if you would ask me, are you proud of having worked for a war criminal? I would say no. But if you add the specific context, it was an informed decision. So I think the short version of this story is that it all depends on the specific situation that you're confronted with, and we've also turned down clients, and we'll see what the future brings.
Well, let's talk about the future, because as I said a couple of times, Tim Bell is an interesting figure. He's kind of like this rogue, dark artist that we all, with the chain smoking, that we all have to see. But Nigel Oakes is just as important and interesting in the story. And he has a quote that says, "We brought science into the world of influencing. We can now identify what will work, guaranteed. Advertising was an art. It became a science and therefore a weapon." Hans, let me start with you, because you've done a lot of work on masses, on crowds, on influencing crowds, on linking crowds to government and so on. Is this true? Can we now judge what a crowd will do if we send message A or B and then therefore guarantee the outcome?
Well, the answer is yes and no. I mean, when I heard him say that in the movie, I felt like, okay, yeah, this is another incarnation of the same message. Every time when there's a new wave of consultants, they will claim that this time they know exactly what the voters are going to do before the voters even know that themselves. And of course, because of technology, we do know more and more. The movie is very much about, the words are not being used, but it's about focus groups, it's about surveys, it's about the techniques of the 1980s and 90s. In large part, it has become obsolete now, and now it's all about data and online information combined with sort of modern psychological insights. And so you will see every few years, you'll see a new wave of companies showing up like, we have the holy grail, and you better go with us. So I think you could say that the level of precision is increasing. At the same time, the pretense is still there, or the pretensions are still very much the same. They never
and there's
change.
no guarantee.
There's always the promise of go with us and then you will win.
And there's no guarantee, because you have this slightly cynical smile. No.
And when typically when there's not that promised win, it's because the candidate did something wrong.
Is that true, Kai? I mean, it is improving though, right? Like Hans says, the means at your disposal to influence a debate with social media, with the tools that we now have, even bots and so on, they're way more advanced than 20 years ago.
Yes, but unfortunately, there are only two guarantees in life, and those are death and taxes. And in political campaigns, there are very little guarantees. I mean, there's so many factors that are outside your control that you have to be very lucky if you can, with your strategy, really have an impact in an election. Sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. We all thought after Barack Obama won the elections that now elections will be data driven and that you could predict pretty much in advance all the actions that you would do. And then Donald Trump came along and ran a very atypical campaign, which was almost a free media campaign where he pretty much threw a PR bomb every day, and he won the elections. And his consultants said this is the way to go. Whenever you win a campaign, people say, and certainly the people that ran the campaign say, this is the model for the future. But that will change. I think in general, coming back to your question, what does this mean for the future? The taxes that Tim Bell said, I wanted to come back to a point I made earlier. I think that the only way to really defend yourself against people like us, like Hans and me, and even the worst versions of ourselves that Tim Bell said in this world, is strong journalism. And this is really a problem because journalism is being destroyed, not just in countries like Russia or Syria, but also in the West. I mean, if you look at our own country, here in the Netherlands, we pretend to be an open country and to be pro-journalism. But our political system basically has been strangling journalism for the past 20 years. Every year they cut more and they cut more, they cut more. And in the strangling, to choke by turning off the money spigot. And if we continue to do that, then we're going to pay a real price, because then the balance will shift too much. I mean, you see too many spokespeople and consultants on the one hand and too few journalists on the other hand, and that balance is a problem.
But it's
I
not
think
only,
there's nothing.
as a journalist, let me cut in. It's not only that, you're right, of course, but it's not only that. It's that people don't want to pay for news. They get what they think is information they want from the internet and elsewhere that looks at least to them true enough to buy it. And
no, that's because we have bought into the PR story that has been brilliantly distributed by the big tech firms that news should be free. I mean, while Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook is buying the islands of Hawaii with the profits he's making of Facebook, how is that possible? And we give all that for free. I mean, we really have to get back to and get away from that big tech spin, because it's really nothing more than that. Nothing's free, and certainly not journalism. It has a very important democratic function.
It's a good point, but Hans, is that a realistic option that Kai is describing now?
Well, we have to turn it into a realistic option, first of all. And second, I think we need to be mindful also about the difference between top ballot races and lower ballot races. And particularly the races at the bottom are very vulnerable, where there is no public information at all. And people, basically, the only clues that they have are paid media. And that starts at a relatively quick level. And I think we're going to see some of that in the Netherlands as well. But an average House race in the United States, there is no free media; it's all paid, and that has implications, because it means that funds need to be raised. It means that corporations buy influence, and then we get into sort of the familiar discussion.
Yeah, I remember that. The three of us, we all spent time in the United States in the 80s and 90s and so on, and then first the city council reporters disappeared, and then the local races reporters disappeared, and so on and so forth. And it happens, unfortunately, after. But what does this mean in terms of? Because there's two things you mentioned. There's money that can buy influence, and then there's the not so much winning a campaign, but at least destroying the other guy's side by sowing confusion and so on. Even the Russians are very open about the fact that that's one of their tactical and strategic objectives, to just, we don't want to win anything. We just want to create chaos and havoc. What are we going to do?
The scary part is that it's so easy to do. So it's a very cost-effective strategy to incite, hatred or racist conflict. And then you just add the poison, and then it starts doing its own work. And that is why I agree with Kai, is that the one of the few ways that you can counter this is by understanding that you have a national problem if you're dealing with media system that has grown too weak. And I think overall in the Netherlands, we tremendously underestimate the importance of that.
Kai, what are we going to do? Because let's start wrapping up. I mean, yeah, journalism is important. We're all for that. We all want that. It's not an entirely different discussion, but a bit it is. What are we going to do to counter the influence actions by non-reliable actors, so to speak? What else other than journalism do you see as an option, and what do you see for the future? What do you see happening?
Well, I think that we can't escape anymore from having to regulate big tech companies. I mean, they've almost become public utilities, and not just on a national level, but on a global level. And I think we have to realize that as citizens. I think the big tech people have to accept it, that, aside from making money, they are also citizens in this world. And I think we need politicians who really understand big tech, which is a real problem. We recall a couple of years ago when Mark Zuckerberg came to testify in Congress, you realized the senators had no idea what they were talking about. But I think, to get away from this whole, in the beginning, the internet was like it was free, it was great, it was like this hippie place. And we just have to realize that it's nothing else but a commercial marketplace. That it has allowed the few to make a lot of money, but also to assemble way too much power, and we just have to take that back and give some of it back to the citizens.
Well, in addition to that, I would say that we also need to make algorithms far more transparent and find ways to do that and make that mandatory. And also sort of create the base level of knowledge about what algorithms do. and sort of create a demand side where suppliers, users of algorithms are forced to be far more open about it. And that's the only way, I think, in order to get a level playing field where we can feel comfortable again.
I think some of those things that you both describe are happening. I think, more openness about algorithms is a discussion point that you hear more and more. And what Kai says, big tech is not as popular in the public opinion as it was a couple of years ago, and politicians both in the US and in Europe are, albeit slightly, tackling big tech. So making journalism stronger, point number 3. I'm not that hopeful personally, but let's try. So finally, from the two of you, if you look at the future of the influence of the Tim Bells of this future, and I'm assuming they're not chain smoking, guys like him anymore, but maybe nerds behind a computer. What do you see happening? Hans first, and then we'll finish with Kai. What do you think is the future of your industry and also the dark artists in your industry for the next couple of years?
Interestingly enough, it's being democratized. So the time where you would have these gurus that were hopping from one city or one country to the next, and I've done that in the past. So I would go to San Juan, and then my travel plans would change, and then I would travel with just my passport and my toothbrush to Europe after the next destination. I think those times are over to a certain extent because, and you're starting to see that also in the Netherlands. I mean, the parties do use consultants from different countries, but it's for specific services, and a lot of European companies are offering those services. So it's no longer the US dominance. But it's more democratic, and all these countries are because of the technological changes, are more or less on a level playing field. So the dominance of the United States in this whole industry, I think, is greatly diminishing.
And I mean, perhaps, and then I'll get to Kai, perhaps a positive point from the documentary we all just saw is that what appeared to me to be a fairly clean grassroots campaign from South Africa was the one bringing down Tim Bell in the end. That wonderful lady whose name currently escapes me, she was the one who was the nail in his coffin.
Yeah, and you also saw the impact of good journalism there.
Mm-hmm. Kai, what do you think, the future, the next couple of years, adding to what Hans said, what is your take?
Well, I think we should focus more on how we can affect real change. I mean, to go back to what you just discussed, I mean, whether or not Tim Bell was brought down by a grassroots campaign in South Africa in terms of politics, nothing has really changed. And I think a lot of the problems that are being caused by governments and by oil companies and by other actors that are happy to be able to point to the Tim Bells of this world and say, these are the boogeymen, to kind of shield them from the things that they're doing themselves. Look at lawyers, look at how in the Netherlands, we're whitewashing money on the South Axle, as it's called here. So I actually don't think the future is very bright because people are getting away with it more and more, and I don't see this changing very quickly.
Which means that movies like Influence will be made in the future as well, undoubtedly the next few years, about what has happened. I want to thank both of you, Hans Anker, Kai van der Linde, for joining us. I want to thank Movies That Matter for broadcasting this film, quote unquote. I mean, we're watching it in the space of our homes right now. So thank you both, gentlemen, and hope to see you next time.
You're welcome.